Good morning, everybody. Today's reading is 2 Samuel, chapter 22, verse 1 to 51, page 255 in the Church Bible. Okay, David's song of deliverance. And David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Saviour, you save me from violence. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. I am saved from my enemies, for the waves of death encompassed me. The torrents of destruction assaulted me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on the cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind, and he made darkness around him in his canopy. Thick clouds gathering of water out of the brightness before him. Coals of fire flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, and he sent out arrows and scattered them. Lightning enrooted them. Then the channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were laid bare. And at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils, he sent from on high. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands he rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. And the Lord has rewarded me accordingly to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in the sight. With the merciful you show yourself merciful. With the blameless man you show yourself blameless. With the purified you deal purely, and with the crooked you make yourself seem tortuous. You save a humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. For you are my lamp, O Lord, and my God lightens my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord has proved true. He is shielded from all those who take refuge in him. For who is God but the Lord? And who is the rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge, and has made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer, and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your gentleness made me great. You gave a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. I pursued my enemies, and I destroyed them, and did not turn back until they were consumed. I consumed them, I thrust them through, so that they did not rise. They fell under my feet, for you equipped me with the strength for the battle. You made those who rise against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs on me, those who hated me, and I destroyed them. They looked, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. I beat them fine as the dust of the earth. I crushed them and stampled them down like the mire of the streets. You delivered me from strife with my people. You kept me as the head of the nations. People whom I have not known served me. Foreigners came cringing to me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners lost heart and came trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lifts them, blessed be my rock, and exalted be my God, the rock of my salvation. The God who gave me vengeance and brought down the peoples under me, who brought me out from my enemies. You exalted me above those who rose against me. You delivered me from the men of violence. For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing praises to your name. Great salvation he brings to his king, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever.
If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 8, which is on page 812. You can see from the screen that despite all of my foreshadowing or forenoticing, I've actually had to steer away from preaching on the subject of discipleship specifically this morning. That's mostly because the work I'm trying to do on that topic is branching into more of a series of sermons than a single one, and I don't want to rush it. So this morning, before our Christmas reflections start next week, we will return one last time to the book of Luke. And the question we will be asking ourselves this morning is, as you can see on the screen, where is your faith? Where is your faith? You will remember in Luke 8 that we've just got to the end of a particular set of stories and a particular flow of thought, and then Luke decides to tell a very famous story that is found in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. Luke chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. The passage begins speaking about Jesus. Verse 22. One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and woke him up, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased. And there was a calm. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid. And they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this that he commands even the winds and water, and they obey him?" That's our short but incredible story for this morning. And the astute among you will be able to detect where I got my sermon title from. Jesus' words, Jesus' key question, where is your faith? We'll be coming back to that specific question later on, but let me set the scenes for those of you who are less familiar. You can see here the Sea of Galilee, which is referred to as a sea in the Bible, but by modern delineations, it's a bit more of a large freshwater lake. It's in the northern part of Israel, above Nazareth, quite away from Jerusalem. And you can see here, it looks quite pleasant, gorgeous Mediterranean climate, and usually very calm. As you can see here, though, despite the fact that it's normally calm, because of its proximity to the Mediterranean, storms roll from the Mediterranean across the land, across the mountains, and onto the Sea of Galilee very, very quickly and without warning. This happens to this day. You can easily be caught out, particularly at evening time, which Mark tells us is when Jesus decided to set sail. The winds from such storms cause waves up to 6 foot high, something like this. Obviously great for surfing, and in most of the boats that you'll get into today, not a huge problem. But the disciples were in a small, shallow fishing boat, only designed really for the calm. We know what these boats look like because in 1986, they discovered one dated from that period. That's an extraordinary piece of archaeology, about 2,000 years old. The metal is just there to support the wooden superstructure. And they can extrapolate what the boat would have looked like based on the base design, as it were. We can see here from this reconstruction just how shallow the boat is and how small the sides are. No more than 4 foot. And I just mentioned 6 foot waves. We can all do the maths there. They reckon the carrying capacity on that boat was up to 15 people. And we know from our story that there are probably all 12 disciples in the boat plus Jesus. And we read in Mark's gospel that the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. So we have a tightly packed, shallow boat, 13 men aboard, rapidly sinking because it's taken on water. There's no holes in the boat necessarily. The water is just pouring in from the outside. Clearly the disciples can't bail out the water quick enough. No life jackets, no coast guard, no hope of rescue 2,000 years ago. So you can imagine you're soaking wet. You're furiously trying to bail out water as the waves are crashing in, and you look around to see the person whose idea it was to go sailing, and he's asleep. And that brings me to my first observation from our text this morning. The humanity of Jesus. The humanity of Jesus. I'm going to be cross-referencing all 3 gospel accounts of this story. They're all remarkably similar, but they all pick up on slightly different details, and I think they're all helpful this morning. Luke 8, so they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. So we can see that Jesus, in spite of the storm, is asleep. We even see in Mark that he has a cushion to sleep on. Now, many have speculated as to just how and why Jesus is able to maintain his sleep during a storm before the disciples wake him up. But what we can see if we read the earlier part of Mark's account is that Jesus has been teaching all day to large crowds without amplification. I'm very fortunate this morning that I have amplification. Jesus didn't. To be clear, studies show that preaching for 30 minutes uses up the same amount of energy as the average person uses in an 8-hour working day. So Jesus is exhausted. And he's probably been teaching for a lot more than 30 minutes. We know that he's tired. We know that he had to go to bed early. When we looked at the raising of Lazarus, we saw that Jesus always knows what's going to happen. Jesus goes to sleep knowing that the storm is coming. And Jesus decides to go to sleep anyway. So Jesus' body is weak. He needs physical rest. As a human example for us, we see him resting in the knowledge that his Father in heaven is caring for him. He knows what's going to happen. He needn't worry. He even sleeps during a storm. You may find that it doesn't take much stress to stop you from sleeping. How would you cope trying to get to sleep on a boat in the middle of a storm, or knowing a storm was coming, or trying to sleep on a plane during turbulence? Jesus is our example. He makes sure that he gets his God-given sleep, secure that the Father is watching over him. We need to bear that in mind, Jesus' relationship with his Father in heaven, his absolute trust, when we come to examine our own relationship with the Father, when we have a look at that nearer the end. The second observation I would like to make is the contrast between the humanity of Christ and the clear and present deity of Christ. Luke 8:24. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. How easy do you find it to do anything, having immediately woken up? I don't know about you, but I find it very difficult to do anything, particularly if it's an evening nap that's been interrupted. Is Jesus groggy? No. He's up and he's on it. He knows what to do, and he has the wherewithal to do it. He's on his feet. And with the power of his words, he immediately solves the problem. Where once there was a storm, there is now calm. Notice this separation in all three accounts between the winds and the sea. The winds and the sea, the winds and the waves, the storm and the waves. The gospel writers are keen to elevate both elements. But what often happens is this story is entitled, Jesus Calms the Storm. Now we're certain of the causal link between winds and waves. And we might forget that in the ancient world, pagans tended to separate the two forces from each other. You may be familiar with the Norse false god of thunder, Thor, as depicted in the Marvel movies. And here's his equivalent god, Jupiter, who in Greek would be called Zeus. You might recall that the gods of the storms in Norse mythology is the son of the most powerful god, and in Greco-Roman mythology is the most powerful of the gods. The gods of the air, of the sky, of storms, of the things above. Here we have Zeus's brother, the false god Poseidon, god of the sea. Different realm, different god, different set of powers. And sometimes these gods are in conflict with one another. If Zeus wanted to get anything done, even though he's the most powerful god in the realm of water, then he would at least have to negotiate with Poseidon. The Greco-Roman understanding of the way that the world is made up has been pushed on the populace of Israel for about 300 years, at least by this point. All the Gentiles and pagans living around them would have had this sort of understanding, and any Jewish people who had fallen under the influence of their rulers would likely have had this sort of thinking infecting them. For the more faithful Jewish person, reflecting on their Old Testament, they will very quickly determine that only God has demonstrated his power over air and over the sea in the Old Testament. And we see that Luke, not only does he naturally differentiate between these two things, but the final statements in our passage highlight the distinction. Who then is this that he commands even the winds and water, and they obey him? None of the gospel writers combine the two ideas. Jesus has power over both realms, both chaotic, tumultuous planes. The point here is clear that despite his human nature that causes him to need to sleep, Jesus' divine nature means that he has power over sea and sky. Complete and instantaneous control over the elements. And for the faithful Jews, a clear indication that this man of God was right up there with Moses and Elijah, who both performed environmental miracles. Notice here that on this occasion, Jesus does not turn to his Father in prayer, that God the Father might enact the work. He does so on his own authority. He commands. Which, if the disciples were really paying attention, was the clearest evidence in this story that Jesus could only have been God. As Gary read earlier in 2 Samuel 22, the Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and routed them. The channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations were laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. Clearly, only God, as revealed in the Old and New Testament, is in control of such things. Only God can rebuke the sea. And so we see once again this repeated theme of the humanity and deity of Jesus. And so we return to our question, where is your faith? Matthew and whoever Luke and Mark's sources were all remember what Jesus said slightly differently. And I think across the course of events, Jesus probably said all three things. I will illustrate this by trying to put all three statements together. Where is your faith? Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? Over the preponderance of these accounts, we can see that Jesus does not believe that they have zero faith, But the problem is that their faith is not sufficient to the situation. I'm informed that the little faith in the Greek of Matthew's text is closer to defective or deficient faith. In Luke, their faith is so small that they've managed to lose it. Where's your faith gone? In Matthew, their faith they have is not enough. It's very little. And in Mark, perhaps Jesus' strongest words of all, the rhetorical, have you still no faith? The faith is so small that the question becomes, is it really there? A bit like the light under the lamp from a couple of weeks ago. Why did the disciples incur this challenge from Jesus? They had enough faith in him to be following him at this stage. They've left behind many things and they're following Jesus. And they trusted him enough to get in a boat with him for an evening voyage. They even turned to him and asked him for help in the storm. They clearly acknowledge that they cannot save themselves without Jesus' help. That's quite a lot of faith, isn't it? Surely they were doing the right thing. Surely if anyone came to us and said that they'd done something similar, we'd think that was a good thing. Clearly, it's not the fact that they ask for help from Jesus, but how they ask that is the problem. Let's examine their alarm calls more closely. In the Luke and in the Matthew, we can clearly see that the disciples have interpreted what is happening to them. They are not calm or collected at all. Yes, they're asking the Saviour to save, but they're assuming that unless Jesus does something, that they will perish. We are perishing. This is going to happen, Jesus. We have seen events. We can see the waves coming in. It's going very badly wrong. Our death is certain unless you do something. Jesus had done wonderful things for the disciples up until this point. And if they'd been listening, they'd know that Jesus' mission was clearly not about to be fulfilled on the Lake of Galilee. There was clearly more Jesus planned to do. But they genuinely entertain the idea that Jesus' mission is about to be sunk on the Sea of Galilee. They genuinely think it's all going to come to an end. They are far more afraid than they should be. They don't have a quiet confidence in God's protection like Jesus does. They're anxious and fatalistic. Mark's account has recorded the worst shout from one or a couple of the disciples. Perhaps why Mark's account carries the harshest rebuke. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? One of the disciples, driven by their anxiety, has gone so far as to question if Jesus even cares. Jesus, we're dying. You could at least wake up and show up and mourn our passing. They take Jesus' quiet confidence and they presume that Jesus doesn't love them. Not just that he won't save them, but he doesn't even care anymore. And in their arrogant anxiety, they even presume to slightly rebuke Jesus. How quickly do our anxieties drive us to fear? And then, in our state of fear, to wonder whether God can save, to doubt. And then, well, if he might not save, to wonder if he even cares enough to consider us, to begin to doubt his love. And then in our pride, resentful at God, we put ourselves above God, demanding that he save us because we have determined that he ought to do so. We go from fear of God to fear of tragedy, which is the first mistake, to despairing of God, to anger with God, to pride over God. This is the wrong way of asking the Lord for help, brothers and sisters. Now, that does not mean, as we can see from the story, that if we ask in the wrong way, God's not going to rescue us. Jesus says if you ask his Father in heaven for something, he will not give you a stone or a serpent. But if you ask him entirely out of fear of the world rather than the fear of God, if you ask him with no hope because you no longer believe that he loves you, If you ask him because you have determined that he is your divine slave, then your faith, such as it is very small, almost insignificant. It's wrong. And if it's the Lord's will to rescue you in such a situation, you can expect his rebuke afterwards. Where is your faith? Where is your faith? As we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the Lord saves us and then does not leave us as we are. We call it sanctification. And here we see that the Lord has rescued his disciples not only from the storm, but from their doubts. He graciously revealed himself to be even more trustworthy and powerful a leader than they previously thought. And he makes sure that they know where they went wrong. There they were, all sat soaking wet, adrenaline still causing shivers amongst the cold. What a day they'd had. Jesus has been teaching all day. They've been basking in his teaching, and then as disciples they've been taken to one side and they've had the inside track given to them. Must have felt pretty good. And then they get to go away with Jesus, the special few, on a boat trip with the teacher. Everyone else is sat on the shore going, I wish I could go with them. Feeling quite special. And Jesus falls asleep, and suddenly they're fighting for their lives. No hope in sight. And then suddenly Jesus rescues them. And the storm stops and the water is calm. Their lives are saved. And then Jesus tells them they've messed up. What a roller coaster. They come to the end and Jesus points out they have been faithless to him. They should have known better by now, but they're still immature. These disciples have only just begun their journey. Where do they go from here? What state does Jesus leave them in? As we can see, Matthew picks up on this element of marveled. Mark picks up on the element of great fear. And Luke combines the two. And they were afraid and they marveled. Two distinct ideas. This is the position they needed to be in. This is the place that they were left in. This was the lesson that Jesus taught them through the storm. They were in the presence of God in the flesh, and they had become distracted by a storm. Rather than marveling at Jesus, they had become preoccupied with bailing out water. They'd stopped fearing God and started fearing instead the winds and the waves, the gods of this world. God allowed for their faith to be tested, to demonstrate to them how small it was, to show them how little they knew of who Jesus really was, and to humble them. Because in their fear of the storms, they had become arrogant. They had taken on the fear of the storm to the point where they were not only living in fear of it, but they were proposing that Jesus should be more afraid. And at the end of the process, Jesus left them amazed by who he was. His response is to reveal more of himself so that they might know him better, that they might marvel about him. And distinct from their amazement, they were also filled with great fear. Were they afraid of a fresh storm? Jesus has just asked them to not be afraid. Why are you afraid, he says to them. What we can see here is that they have transferred their fear from the lesser false gods of the winds and the waves and onto the master of the winds and the waves. They've realized that at a moment's notice, Jesus could, if he willed, demand higher waves from the sea and they would all be drowned. But because of this combination of marveling and fearing, they recognize that Jesus is the most powerful being in Galilee and that nothing else should scare them as a result. And simultaneously, in their amazement, they know that Jesus did care about them. And that, therefore, there was not going to be any direct use of his awesome power against them. They were fearing God because he's the only one for whom it is right to fear. A different sort of fear that has a very different effect than fearing the things of this world. They are now ready to receive more wisdom, and they need it. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that's the place that Jesus returns them to. They will continue to be discipled by Jesus, to grow in their faith, so that the next time a storm comes, and it will, they would not succumb to fear so easily. It's a stormy time of year, folks. Few here have lived so sheltered a life to have not already learnt the lesson that the world and our life in it is one storm after another. The waters are never calm for that long. Together we have forecasted an economic storm. We have the prospect, although it seems to be upon us, of a cold and expensive winter. Some of us will face that winter alone. Some of us will face that with people that should bring comfort to them, but in fact, because of their relationship with their families, they will really struggle this winter. And so for some of us, the most depressing part of the year is coming for those who already suffer with depression. And for some here, all I have to do is mention these things and the anxiety levels begin to rise. The longer we have been Christians, me included, the more occasions we can think of where we lacked faith. The more storms we can remember and went, wow, I really fell short on that occasion. Where our faith was not sufficient to protect us from fear. Where we feared other gods rather than the one true living God. Testing is ahead of us, brothers and sisters. We read about it in the parable of the sower, where God will expose to us, just like he exposed to his disciples, the extent of the lack of our faith. Where is your faith? That question is coming. The Lord will ask it of you. How will you answer it? Now, if you do not know Jesus, if you have no faith, not even the tiniest speck, and you resist the call to put your faith in Jesus and to fear God, then I will make a prediction that I know from the scriptures to be 100% accurate. You will live your life moving from one fear to the next. You will never be at peace. And one day the fear of death will come upon you, even if you don't think it will. And soon after that, if you do not turn to the Lord, you will fear him on Judgment Day, and you will fear him for all eternity under his wrath. Jesus died not in the Sea of Galilee, but on the cross so that you could avoid that fate. So that you might fear Almighty God before it's too late. He was risen because he did not fear death, because God holds the keys to the sea, to the sky, to life, and to death. If God does not exist, then all your fears are meaningless anyway, and you cannot be rid of them. And if he does, which he does, then fearing anything above him is foolishness. Sure, you're afraid to become a Christian. You're afraid of what the cost might be. You're afraid of what it would be like to live for Jesus rather than for yourself. You're afraid of all the things you might lose, all the things that you're so afraid to lose at the moment, all those things you can't take with you past the grave. My encouragement to you, unbeliever, this morning, turn from your misplaced sinful fear and put your faith in him who commands all things, as we saw in the Psalms, as we saw in 2 Samuel, and as we see in the book of Luke and Matthew and Mark. And if you read those Gospels, you will see that Jesus would die and be raised that you might fear him and love him today. Ask God for these things, I urge you. Where is your faith, believer? That question is coming. How will you answer it? If this morning you realize you're already clutching at the straws of very little faith, and you're kind of anticipating a storm and you're not hopeful, then the first thing I would refer you back to is Mick's sermon from a few weeks ago. First thing to do, I believe, help my unbelief. That should be a daily prayer for all of us. Even if you only have a mustard seed at the moment, just like the disciples of the boat, and you realize, I need more, then ask Jesus for more faith. I will add from our story this morning one more idea. That we need, if we are to ride out the storm, that if we are to prepare ourselves, we need to focus on adopting a position of humility. Or we will find ourselves being humbled by God. Because he loves us, because he will discipline us if we rebel. It's a lot less painful if we humble ourselves in advance of testing. We must fix ourselves on a course of ever increasingly marveling and fearing the Lord. We must reflect upon him. We must reflect on his works and all that he has done. We must fix our eyes on Jesus so that we are not distracted by the storms of life. So that we remember who he is, our relatable human example, who is God, who died for us and reconciled us before holy God, and who reigns over the whole universe. And has adopted us, you and me, to be his son or daughter. If we can do this, if we can devote ourselves to this, through the study of the word, through prayer, through praise, through devoting ourselves to one another, we will find ourselves continually marveling at the wonders of God, fearing his power, safe in the knowledge that his power will not be used against us. Whatever storm we find ourselves in the coming weeks and months, brothers and sisters, it is my testimony and the proclamation of the scriptures that though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we can fear no evil, for he is with us, and his rod and staff, they comfort us. He will always pull us out of such situations, either by promotion to glory, or because he has more work for us to do, and that will always, whilst we remain on earth, leave us more sanctified post-storm than when we went in. And all of those here, if we're feeling like we've had enough of the storms, can look forward to a day when all the winds are calm and all the waters are still. On that day, our testing will be over and our sanctification complete. And we will marvel at Jesus for all eternity.